Welcome everyone to the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice webinar series on restorative justice in education. In 2014, school administrators received a Dear Colleague letter from the US Department of Justice and the US Department of Education highlighting racial disproportionality in school discipline. The letter calls for schools to begin addressing the excessive use of suspensions and expulsions and suggests that restorative justice might be one alternative to exclusionary discipline. According to educational researcher Gregory, disproportionality in school discipline is related to a lack of cultural responsiveness in classrooms, as well as things like implicit bias, negative stereotypes, and low expectations. She suggests that building healthy relationships with students might interrupt some of these factors, building trust, understanding, and cultural awareness. Restorative justice practices are built on those assumptions. In her 2013 research, Gregory found that implementing restorative practices in school increased the likelihood that students felt respected by their teachers and decreased the disparity gap in school discipline. In this webinar series, we hope to highlight some of the good restorative justice work being done in school settings. Previous webinars have given us the opportunity to hear from students who are trained to use circle processes to help address school conflict, as well as students and administrators who are using restorative justice practices to address issues of academic integrity. Recently, we heard from two distinguished educators and researchers on the importance of building relationships with students and how restorative justice education helps teachers adopt a relational pedagogy. Recordings of these webinars are all available online. And today in this webinar, Carl Stauffer, Kathy Evans, and Johanna Turner, all from Eastern Mennonite University, will discuss restorative justice in education and examines the ways in which the implementation of restorative justice in school settings can address racial disproportionality and interrupt the cradle-to-prison pipeline. This specific webinar series is supported by Coming to the Table, an organization affiliated with Eastern Mennonite University. We are grateful to Coming to the Table for their work and for their continuous support, and we now have a brief film provided by Coming to the Table.
Coming to the Table, a racial reconciliation program affiliated with the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University, is pleased to co-sponsor this webinar series on restorative justice in education. Members of Coming to the Table are dedicated to dismantling the so-called school-to-prison pipeline and strongly support the introduction of restorative justice approaches to school discipline and the creation of healthy school communities as keys to success in this endeavor. Coming to the Table provides leadership, resources, and a supportive environment for all who wish to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that is rooted in the United States history of slavery. You can learn more at comingtothetable.org. We hope this webinar series inspires many people to find effective ways to take action in your community to build a better world today and for future generations.
Great, and with that announcement, I'd now like to hand it over to Carl Stauffer, who is facilitating our session today and will be speaking with our two guests.
Thank you, Jordan. And I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, and thank you for coming out and taking the time. And I'm looking forward to our discussion, which I expect to be rich and deep, with two excellent guests, panelists with me today for this discussion. My name is Carl Stauffer. I'm a faculty here at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, particularly in the area of justice and development studies. I'm going to go ahead and lead us right into an introduction for our two guests, and then we'll move into our theme, which Jordan has nicely expounded for us today. I want you to feel free to be thinking about your questions and how you'd like to interact with the guests we have with us today. And feel free to begin to put those questions on the Q&A icon button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be taking ample time for discussion. Let me first of all introduce our panelists, and first of all introduce Dr. Kathy Evans. And Kathy's Assistant Professor of Education here at EMU. She's been here since 2011. Her research and teaching and scholarship focuses on ways in which teachers participate in creating more just and equitable educational opportunities for all students, including those with disability labels, those who exhibit challenging behavior, and those who are marginalized for a variety of reasons. Kathy holds a PhD in educational psychology and research from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Her dissertation research employed phenomenological interviews with middle school students about the experiences with in-school suspension. So this is her area. To graduate school, Evans was a middle and high school special educator for students identified as having learning, behavior, and emotional challenges. Dr. Evans has been active in furthering the field of restorative justice in education, both through her scholarship and teaching. And we are really happy to be in collaboration with Dr. Evans here at EMU, Eastern Mennonite University, through the Center of Justice and Peace Building. So we've been working on an interdisciplinary concentration that Kathy's giving leadership to the restorative justice education within the current Master's in Education degree program here at our university. With Kathy and joining us is Dr. Joanna Turner, and I'm pleased to announce that Joanna Turner is our newest member of faculty here at the Center for Justice and Peace Building as Assistant Professor of Restorative Justice and Peace Building. She will be joining us as a special guest in our November webinar, so please mark the date for that, November 18th, and talking in much more depth about her background and what she brings to the conversation. Dr. Turner earned her PhD from the University of Maryland, developing an expertise in youth activism and organizing, critical prison studies, the arts, culture, and social change. For over 15 years, Turner has worked with arts collectives, community organizing groups, and other social movement organizations to build youth leadership, enfranchise marginalized communities, and advance restorative and transformative approaches for community safety. In 2007, she was a Soros Justice Fellow with the Open Society Institute, and she worked alongside young people to research and promote community-based strategies for challenging violence and launching youth leadership development programs that integrated peace education, arts, and media, as well as movement building and trauma healing. In 2008, Turner collaborated with local teenagers to produce Vision is Our Power, a documentary film on ending violence against youth, including gun violence, dating violence, and police violence. Johonna is a former District of Columbia Public Schools teacher. Her roles ranged from English and special education teacher at a large high school to reading teacher and instructional leader at a small elementary school. At the University of Maryland, Dr. Turner has taught in the Departments of American Studies, African American Studies, and Women's Studies. And so it's a real pleasure to have both of these incredible panelists with me today to have this discussion. And as opposed to a presentation with response, we're gonna try to have a bit more of a informal conversation, if you will, amongst us. And so in that process, I'm sure, as I said, you'll have some questions coming to mind. So please feel free to note those down, and we'll open up space for full conversation with all of you who have joined us today. And I'm going to start off by, Kathy and I spent some time talking about how we might want to look at this particular webinar. And Johonna has been kind enough to offer her experience and sort of be at hand to serve as a resource to this conversation. So thank you, Johonna, for doing that. It's somewhat of a last-minute notice. I think we're going to start with just a basic question. I think lots of times in our work, there is lingo. There are phrases that get thrown out there. The media picks up on them. school policy picks on them, but some of us are so busy doing the work that we don't investigate what's behind the phraseology. And so I want us to take a little bit of time to back up for those who might be joining us who really don't know the background and some of the history and what exactly we're referring to when we talk about school-to-prison pipeline, or as Kathy would like to often say and often reminds us, cradle-to-prison pipeline. Kathy, I'm going to invite you to jump in here and tell us about those phrases and what's behind them and why they're so critical to the current political environment that we're in right now.
Thanks, Carl, and thank you, Joanna, for joining us. I do appreciate you being here. I look forward to your response to this question as well. For me, in the way I understand the cradle-to-prison pipeline, there's a sense that certain ways of interacting with students at early ages impact their development and their growth, and the way that they build identities, the way that they are labeled by others. And so what happens, I think, for a lot of youth, a lot of children, is they get in a track. And things perpetuate. So you have a 5-year-old who is demonstrating a lack of self-regulation according to the teacher's perspective. And so that teacher is constantly on his case or her case. And then so they begin to dislike school. They disengage with school. Because they're disengaged, they're seen as less capable. And so we get assumptions about students' capacities. Interesting, when we talk about disproportionality as a special ed professor, one of the things that I want to always bring up is that same disproportional numbers that we see in discipline, we also see in special education. So in particular categories of special ed, we have higher numbers of African American and Latino youth, brown and black-bodied individuals. And so we see the same kind of disproportionality playing out. And so how much of that gets perpetuated as school goes along? And then we also see later on lack of academic success, and being suspended leads to dropouts, and dropouts leads to disproportionate connections with the juvenile justice system. Dropping out also is an indicator of incarceration at later in down the road. And so I think the language of the pipeline to prison, whether we start that at birth through other kinds of inequities, cultural assumptions, poverty, etc., or whether we start that when the student enters at the school level, there are certain tracks that get laid down that are really hard for kids to get out of once all of those factors start playing in. I'll stop there for a second. Joanna, how would you, I mean, like, I really want to have a conversation. So, like, how would you respond to that?
Sure. I think that is very helpful, the way that you've kind of laid out the intersections among schools and then the criminal legal system. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. If you highlight it, it's the confluence of specific policies and practices that push students out of school and into prison. And I think it is very important and useful to talk about a school-to-prison pipeline when we're talking about education, because what that offers, one, it offers us a way to think about how injustices with the criminal legal system are intersecting with injustices in our education system. There is an organization in Colorado, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Parents and Youth United, and they talk about this as for decades, as communities of color, we've been very attentive, very aware of the incursion of this unjust criminal legal system in our lives, in our communities, the hyper-criminalization, the over-policing, the mass incarceration that has been a fixture in our communities. And then also being aware of educational failure, the way that schools have continued to fail, particularly low-income communities of color, the disinvestment of resources. And so what's happening now with the school-to-prison pipeline is that these systems are actually intersecting and working together.
So Gloria, you mentioned inadequate resources. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about the education debt, that because of those inequitable resources that are provided to certain schools, we have certain schools not being able to have access to the same opportunities that other schools, and that in and of itself can contribute to that pipeline as well.
I agree, and it's also the choice of what those resources are going for. So definitely the lack of resources, but also the focus on resources that actually support policing, that support the contact of young people with the kind of carceral systems and processes with incarceration. So for example, in many schools, particularly schools in working class communities of color, rather than use resources for school counselors and school psychologists, resources are being used for metal detectors, for school resource officers, which are basically security guards that kind of intersect with police officers in the school. Police officers, police officers that are functioning in some ways as security guards, but have the ability to arrest students in the school. So it's, yes, definitely, I agree. It's the lack of resources, but also what those resources are being used for.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So I'm wondering, while we're hearing this is really, really important and really helpful to dig a little deeper in here, but I'm imagining there are some folks in this webinar right now saying, how did we get here? Or were we always here and it's just being highlighted now? And how did we get here? And again, we're busy folks doing whatever we're doing in our professional life, and we don't have time often to stop and read some of the analysis that's out there and some of the critical analysis that's out there. For instance, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. So how would you in a thumbnail sketch talk about the history of how we've got to this place?
Well, I think one of the things is the failure to examine our own racial, ethnic, linguistic, socioeconomic bias. Some of the times, I think, well, not some of the times, most of the time, those biases remain implicit at the uninterrogated level. And so we have a teaching field that is still predominantly white, holding on to assumptions and stereotypes and bias, and that impacting the way that decisions are made, both about discipline and about funding and about a myriad of other things. And so I think one of the things is, as history has gone, we haven't interrogated those assumptions. We haven't pushed ourselves to examine our own whiteness, for example, and our own cultural norms and biases, and I see it in a lot of different places. So as a professor in the education department, one of the things, and I just did it today in my class this afternoon, we had a whole conversation talking with Bell Hooks and Beverly Tatum and some readings that they did in preparation for class about their own bias, their own assumptions as teachers. And so I think when we start unpacking those, it can get messy, and I think sometimes people avoid doing that. So for me, a lot of where we are now can be traced to people who look like me not examining our own assumptions about what we're doing in schools.
Sure, I think that I mean, there's also internalized racism as well, and so I think that you're definitely right in terms of the structural racism, the ways in which that becomes internalized, interpersonal racism, in ways that as well as other systems of oppression, in the way that is it manifests itself in classrooms, among administrators, and then also, Kathy, I think that we would also benefit from looking at the role that kind of national discourse and national kind of policy trends have played as well. I mean, we can go back to the 1980s and talk about the war on drugs and the role that has played in terms of the expansion of police powers, particularly within communities of color and low-income communities. And then also looking at the 90s, and there's a whole national kind of myth around young people of color as super predators. And then the way that became operationalized within policies, and those policies were also manifested in schools. And so yes, the interpersonal definitely, but also looking at the role of those discourses and the role of policies, particularly at the national scale. And a number of those policies in terms of the zero tolerance policies, the broken windows policies that were very much a fixture of the war on drugs and the kind of the proliferation of policing within communities of color, those have now become a part of the schools. And so what's happening is that the same ideas, the same ideologies that are used with kind of what the communities at large are used to run school systems. And so that's part of how we're getting what we're seeing now in terms of these intersections.
So I hear you saying that when we start enacting policies, those policies perpetuate things that are already in place, but also exacerbate those things. For example, the GunFree Schools Act seems very logical, right? Of course we don't want guns to be in schools. And yet, what it ended up doing was increasing the number of suspensions and expulsions and being expanded to apply to all kinds of discipline issues, quote unquote, that didn't have anything to do with guns or school safety, but they were labeled under school safety as a way to intentionally or unintentionally, depending on how you want to frame that, exclude certain students, particularly Black and brown students.
Exactly, and I really appreciate what you're pointing out, because, and this is actually going to some of my dissertation research, but with the example that you gave, it really highlights, in particular, you're talking about a policy that is supposed to be targeted at keeping students safe, at keeping young people safe. However, when we think about a particular discourse around young people and safety and violence, and that is youth violence is typically imagined as Black and brown young people, particularly males, being violent against one another. And when we imagine violence that way, we're going to end up with policies that are violent to Black and brown male youth, or Black and brown young people in particular, rather than looking at the ways in which young people need to be kept safe from both interpersonal and structural violence.
Right.
So I think one of the things that's worth noting is just in general in our society here in the North American scene, there has been a real, over the last few decades, a real extension of the reach of the surveillance and control of the criminal justice system. We've moved into legislating and criminalizing actions that were not on the criminal radar in the past, and some of that creep is affecting all of our institutions in different ways. And I think that's another thing that is worth we might not have time right now to unravel. And as you rightfully said, Joanna, that's really been partly a result of the war on drugs, as we said, and criminalizing acts that otherwise may not have been, especially very lesser and misdemeanor crimes. And this philosophy in policing that if we take care of the smallest crimes, it affects the bigger ones, and then we end up surveilling and controlling societies and communities, particular communities of color, and the chances of rubbing up against the law and getting in trouble and ending up in the system grow. We then need to talk about the political, I mean, we don't have time to get into that, but then there was the political opportunity as well as the economic opportunity, and we certainly know what's referred to as the sort of corrections or even criminal justice industrial complex, and it's a and the prisons industrial complex and the amount of profit that's bringing in. And so there's a whole set of structural and legislative and political opportunities that I think are coinciding in a way that have brought us to this point.
And I really appreciate, Johnny, you bringing up that, like, we have to consider those structural pieces and look at the interpersonal things, and we can't, exclude one or the other. And so really there has to be, so when we talk in a bit about restorative justice, like, that has to be those interpersonal pieces that restorative justice can provide, but also restorative justice as looking more, and I think you would use the word transformative justice in that sense of how do we transform some of these society policies, the structures, and things like that that have brought us to this place.
I would completely agree. And just to kind of an example of the connections between the two, as you say, it's so important to look at multiple levels of the problem and therefore multiple levels of change. And so, for example, if you have a school in which students can be suspended and expelled for both, for a range of offenses, including minor offenses, if students can be suspended from school for being disrespectful to a teacher, okay, that's part of a policy. It's part of a zero tolerance policy or kind of exclusionary discipline policies that are available in a school. The end of kind of interpersonal, some of the ways that becomes manifested, the kind of linkage there is a teacher has the discretion to decide what student she's going to send out of her classroom or what student she's going to refer for being disrespectful or insubordinate. And most of the time, the students that are being seen as disrespectful, charged with insubordination, are students of color. Right. That's an example of how, definitely the intersections. I mean, there are many, but just to give one example.
Right, and so in looking at zero tolerance policies or in looking at exclusionary discipline in general, one of the things that's over and over talked about in the research is and you use discretionary, is that the word? I'm not sure which you use, but discretionary or the capriciousness of how those policies are played out. And so being able to say, for example, and I wrote down a phrase that showed up in my dissertation research, conduct prejudicial to good order. Like that's one of the codes on the discipline form. And so I think they found that it was a huge number of students that were suspended under that designation. Well, what does that mean? It could mean anything, right? And so it becomes a convenient way for teachers to exclude students, again, implicitly or overtly, for things that might not match my own cultural norm, or that might not match the way that I would want it to be done. So assumptions about what is normal from my perspective without being able to, and that's where I want to bring in cultural humility, cultural awareness, culturally responsive pedagogy, and things like that to address some of these issues. So again, more at the interpersonal level. Interestingly, because people would call me a systems thinker sometimes. So, and yet here I am talking about interpersonal stuff. So, can we talk a little bit more about just the consequences of exclusionary discipline? Because I don't want to make assumptions that everybody would agree that suspending students isn't a viable or isn't a good option. And so can we talk a little bit more just about some of the consequences of suspensions and expulsions?
Sure, and kind of related to the consequences we referred to before, we talked about students of color specifically, but just in terms of thinking intersectionally, Kathy, you've brought up the ways in which students with disabilities, particularly behavioral and learning disabilities, are disproportionately affected. LGBTQ students are also affected, and we don't want to think about that as students of color and students with disabilities and LGBTQ students. What we want to think about that is the ways in which these categories are overlapping. So that means that, for example, students of color with disabilities oftentimes are much more likely to be suspended. It doesn't mean that we don't have white students with disabilities. That's definitely the case. But oftentimes, again, these are students with multiple factors that are affecting their likelihood to end up pushed out of school and into the criminal legal system.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you bring up that intersectionality. I'm working on a project right now on LGBTQ youth being overly suspended. And so it leads me to a lot of questions as well about the ways that those intersections happen. as far as just the consequences of exclusionary discipline, why is it so bad to suspend a kid? What are the long-term impacts? And I think one of the things that happens, for example, you talk about metal detectors and policemen on campuses, and so the sense that that's creating a safer environment, we've actually proven that it's not. It's actually creating a more fearful environment. And so all of this heavy policing that we're seeing is actually exacerbating the behaviors that we don't want to see, because it's deteriorating any kind of school safety or climate of trust, a climate of community building that would happen in that place. So I think one of the consequences of exclusionary discipline is that it exacerbates the antagonism that we see between students and teachers, or between students and students.
Mm-hmm. As well as administrators and other school staff.
Administrators, parents, caregivers. So I think Hyman would call that a toxic environment. And he wrote a book called Toxic Schools, where he talks about all of this heavy policing activity actually erodes the culture and the climate that you're hoping to establish that would be productive to good learning. So, and however we want to phrase that, schools exist to help kids learn. And if there are things happening that are interfering with that, then addressing those. Yeah. We'll leave it there for right now. The other thing is just the consequences for academic performance, and how students being expelled and suspended impacts academics, creating lack of opportunities. And even one suspension, a 3-day suspension, tracks a kid backwards. They lose time in the classroom, they're further behind, they miss out on stuff, and they begin to disconnect unless we take serious steps to reincorporate them or reintegrate them back in after a suspension. So academic, and then we already talked about the role of dropouts, and I keep talking about inadvertent or implicit versus overt. I think people might use the phrase dropout or push out. And how we want to play with that language, that some students aren't dropping out, they feel pushed out. They feel like they really didn't have a choice but to drop out. And so how many factors are standing against their being able to succeed there, and suspensions and exclusionary discipline being one of those.
That's right. Yeah. If you continue to suspend me over and over again, I'm going to get the message that you don't want me here at this school, that this is not the place for me where I'm going to succeed, where I'm going to be able to learn, where I'm going to be able to thrive. And so that definitely is a push out. And as you said, organizers have been framing it that way intentionally to bring attention to that. And also in terms of attendance rates, why am I going to come back to make an effort? So you're increasing truancy. And then, in terms of young people themselves, their sense of emotional health, just kind of a psychological well-being is being affected. In terms of we're talking about the SchooltoPrison Pipeline. What's happening when they are not in school? That's actually increasing their own vulnerability to a range of factors, a range of things, including their contact with police. Many police officers are looking for students who, are not in school. So even if I'm suspended, that's bringing me into contact with police officers. I'm out on the street where I can be picked up for truancy. And so, and then also, getting involved in a range of things out that are, on the street, depending on where you are, what neighborhood that you're in. So those are definitely some outcomes. And in general, there also is, it sends a message to young people that my needs are not being addressed here. This is not the place that can meet my needs. If I have, we all have a need to belong. Membership and belonging are core needs. If I have a need to learn how to read, even if I'm in middle school and high school, my need is not being met here.
Right. And so what happens is we have a kiddo who already feels excluded, and then we suspend them, and it only exacerbates their feeling of, this is not my place. These are not my people. This is not a place where I'm safe and wanted and invited in. And so the exclusionary discipline then just creates that cycle of continuing to feel more and more alienated, marginalized, and not having school becomes irrelevant then in that sense. There's a question in the queue that I think would be fun to answer in this place. Explain how a law against having guns in school is applied unfairly to unfairly discipline kids of color. So a kid of color does something and gets viewed as violating this rule against weapons, and is fair. How? So could you speak to, like, how does the GunFree Schools Act actually serve as a discriminatory kind of policy?
An example, and feel free to jump in here, Kathy, but just an example would be that just in terms of looking at weapons in general, there's a lot of discretion in terms of what school officials can count as a weapon. So there have been cases in which students have been suspended, even expelled actually, for having toy guns, various items. There was actually a case, I don't know if you saw this on the news, of the young lady who was actually, I believe she was expelled from school for a chemistry project. And they said it was a young Black woman, and they said that they counted it as a bomb or some type of explosive. But did you see that story? You want to comment on that story in particular?
No, but I was going to compare it, though, to another case about some students having a hunting rifle in their car and not getting suspended. And those were white students. And so I wonder if the way that those things get played out in different communities also, and so it's not just that it's a white kid or a Black kid, but it's the communities and the norms that exist or are established in those communities.
That's right.
So does that make sense?
Yes.
There was another question, Kathy. I don't know if you caught that too, that we might want to talk to right now, because we've been right in the middle of that. Can you clarify the terminology of exclusionary discipline? What exactly does that mean? And nuance criminal legal system versus criminal justice system.
I could speak to the first. I'm not sure I have the credentials to speak to the second one. But for me, the term exclusionary discipline is any form of discipline that separates a student from their normal learning environment. And so for me, I would include in-school suspension in that. And so my dissertation research was on looking at in-school suspension, and the students that I interviewed definitely felt like they had been excluded from their learning environment. They were not allowed to go to class or be in contact with their peers or colleagues. And they were missing content in the same way that they would have missed it if they'd have been home, because teachers weren't sending appropriate academic resources. The lessons weren't being delivered. They weren't getting access to the learning environment at all. And so I would call that exclusionary discipline as well. In addition to, obviously, suspensions where you're home for 3 days, or expulsions where you're home for a year or more. So anything to add to that?
In terms of, I think that you summarized it well, just discipline policies that are excluding students from participating in school. And so what are other ways of disciplining? I'm sure we're going to go to that discussion that don't exclude students from the classroom and day-to-day life in the school.
Could someone else speak to the criminal legal system versus criminal justice system?
I'll speak to that, because I use that term criminal legal system, and I actually use it to refer to the same thing that most people mean when they use criminal justice system. For me, it's more, whereas you can argue that there are different paradigms of justice in terms of criminal justice, some people say retributive justice, but in terms of talking about the system, I like to use criminal legal system rather than criminal justice, because I don't believe that it is a system that reflects justice. And so just pointing out that it is a system set up to kind of address crime, however defined, because there are very many ways in which even the definition of crime itself is can be very discriminatory. For example, crimes that and this relates to the school to prison pipeline, kind of a side note, but just there are laws that define groups of young people as gangs that are very discriminatory in their definition, whereas a group of young white men walking down the street with the same, with polo shirts, would not be seen as a gang the same way as a group of young Latino men, for example, with t-shirts or similar colors. And so this goes a lot more to kind of some of the work things going on in LA are really, there's a lot of organizing going on around the ways in which just some of these laws, and other places too, but just give that as an example, because of the work there, are being put on the books. But the point is that criminal legal system I use to take out that word justice, because justice is, I don't see that as the focus.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could get into then talking about, so what does restorative justice offer to this predicament, to the situation, to what we've been analyzing and describing here as the school to prison pipeline? What are the possibilities for our day speaking to some of these issues, and how?
Well, I think for me, the notion that we have to talk about justice as part of restorative justice is critical. I know that some people have been moving to the language of restorative practices, and I'm really thankful that here at EMU we're not doing that. There are a set of restorative justice practices, but I don't want to lose the word justice because of some of the conversations that we've had, some of the things we've talked about today. And so one of the things for me that restorative justice does is focus on justice. And what does justice look like in a school environment? So how just is it that this school is receiving less funding than this school? They're in the same state, they're 30 miles apart, they're in two different districts that are funded differently. How do we call that justice? And so how can we interrogate some of those things? And I think restorative justice gives space for those. That was me going at the structural level to look at interpersonal and what happens in a classroom. If my textbook is still talking about westward expansion without really talking about colonizing Native Americans, then our curriculum is unjust. And students sense that, and they sense that injustice in the way we're teaching history. And so there's a lot of ways that justice is and is not recognized in the way we do class, the way we do schooling. And so I think restorative justice can contribute to that at a big, broad level, as well as in classroom practices and school practices. Beyond that, I think at the core of restorative justice is an emphasis on relationships. I think that's what we do, is build healthy and meaningful relationships. A lot of what I think we've talked about as far as cultural mismatches, when we start putting students in circle together and really listening to one another to understand, I think we can start to tear down some of those implicit biases. And we begin to understand one another better. And so I think just the relational emphasis of restorative justice can really help bridge some of those gaps and eliminate some of the things. I also think that it helps us work through conflict. We can unpack some of these a little bit more. But I think the emphasis on responding to conflict and having tools in our tool belt for addressing conflict in the classroom, not trying to eschew the conflict, but actually embracing it and realizing that it has transformative capacities is a big piece of that. So those are just a few things that pop out in a broad, sweeping kind of answer.
So there's a kind of, let me just back up a little bit and catch some things that I think I'm hearing you say, Kathy. There's a container, there's a frame. Restorative justice provides a kind of container and a frame, some sort of values and principles and practices that could help to contain some of the issues that we're talking about here. In other words, why students act out unless the root issues are being addressed. And restorative justice can also almost be somewhat preventative if it's done well and across the system, in the sense that it's providing a space for people to work with some of these issues in a safe place that the classroom could be, but it's going to take a shift. Sure. Would that be one way of talking about it at an interpersonal level?
Sure, and I think at EMU, one of the ways we've broken it down, and we're going to continue to use the language of restorative justice in education, not just as what we do when kids misbehave. And I'm going to put misbehave in quotations, right? Because those behaviors are defined by someone. And so sometimes it is misbehavior, but a lot of times it's just misunderstood behavior. If we assume that behavior is communicating and we're not paying attention to what is being communicated, then is the behavior really misbehavior on the part of the student, or is it us not understanding what the student is trying to convey to us? And so as a teacher educator, one of the things that I really want to help teachers to think about is, what is it that the student is trying to tell you when they refuse to do your homework, when they're not showing up for class, when they're 10 minutes late? What is it that they're trying to communicate? So yeah, I lost my train of thought. But at EMU, we are looking at 3 big ideas when we pull those together. And the first one, and I have a graphic that I could share, but building and maintaining healthy relationships. And how do we do that, and what are some things that we can do to build and maintain healthy relationships? The second one is creating just and equitable learning environments. And that's the conversations we've had about justice in school and the classroom level, as well as at a community level. And then the third one is repairing harm and transforming conflict. So those 3 big ideas, to me, would be building a climate in a school that has certain characterizations that's good for all of our students. And then I would see restorative discipline as, okay, sometimes all those things that we do to create a good climate, they're still not going to be effective. I mean, we're still going to have kids misbehave. We're still going to have kids do things that we wish that they wouldn't do. And then we have these discipline processes that are in place as well to address those moments. But hopefully we can continue to work towards building school and classroom climates where a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing are avoided because we have created places for healthy relationships. We have built social and emotional capacities. We have created just and equitable environments. Yeah.
So let me play the skeptic here a little bit, though. I'm the teacher out there who's saying, I feel unsafe when I go into my classroom every day. I actually feel threatened. What am I supposed to do? You know, and I, you know, what do we do with that? What do we say with those actions that are violating? I'm sure there's some folk out there, and there's plenty of cases where a suspension helped a kid think through something and they came back with a better attitude. What are we saying to them? How are we having that discussion with teachers who might be feeling like, well, this is out of control. I don't know what else I have at my disposal to feel safe.
Joanna there. John, you've been a teacher. Like, you were not long ago in the classroom. Well, were there times when you felt unsafe by students' behaviors?
Just 2 years ago, I was in a high school, and I would say that there were, you know, there were a number of teachers who had that feeling of being unsafe. I think it wasn't just the school. I think it was the neighborhood as well. They weren't comfortable in the neighborhood that the school was located in. I actually lived in the neighborhood of both of the schools that I worked at. I lived in the neighborhood of the school. So the students, I saw them walking down the street. They were my neighbors in addition to being my students. And that made a difference in terms of my ability to, you know, understand kind of where the students are coming from. I would say one thing, and this is kind of goes back to what you're saying in terms of prevention and relationships, is that you can't begin to think about this at the point in which things are out of control. We said that's not the best start, but from day one, the first day of school, how to begin developing a community in your classroom. And so I did not focus on in starting the school year. You know, I put a lot of focus on, you know, games, ways to games in the sense of what I mean by games is basically kind of icebreakers, activities to help the young people get to know each other. Yes, you can bring in the content even then, but bring it in a way that helps students to build community, to work in groups, to get a sense of the student. So having even just a time for students to check in and let me know how they're doing has helped, because a student might come in with an attitude, might snap at me, but really it's because of a situation that's going on at home. For example, with the student's mom, I've had a student later come back to me and say, you know, I didn't mean to come at you that way. I shouldn't have come at you that way. It's because of this such and such is going on with my mom. But again, the ability even to have that interaction depends upon the relationship that has been built with that student. So that's something there, you know, just kind of understanding the root causes and creating systems and structures in your classroom, even though it can be quite difficult, where those relationships can take shape.
I want us to turn to some really excellent questions. Kathy, did you want to comment on that?
I was going to say that one of the things that we talk about in the teacher education classes here is spend the extra time at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of the year, building those healthy relationships, recognizing that if you do that at the beginning, you lay a good foundation for what you're talking about, having those hard conversations later, for the student trusting you enough to come and say, hey, I really don't know how to do this. I can't tell you the number of times students would come to me as a special education teacher and go, I totally didn't understand anything Ms. Smith said in class today. And I would say, did you ask them for help? Oh, no, she would just make fun of me, or I don't know, I would never ask her for help. Like that there is some kind of relational barrier between the student and that teacher. But when they feel safe enough to be able just to come and say, I don't understand, like even that, promoting learning environments that allow for students to say, I don't know, I don't understand. So I think, even looking today at the Cradle to Prison Pipeline or the School to Prison Pipeline, like recognizing that we're not just talking about discipline issues. That's a big piece of it, but there's also this whole academic piece that we really want to promote learning. And I think every teacher would say, yes, I want all of my students to learn. So how do we build those healthy relationships? And so what does it look like to spend the first little bit really laying down those good foundations relationally?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I want to take on some questions here if we're ready to move in that. One of the ones I think find quite interesting right here, I just want us to spend a little to comment on, is this from one of the participants. Is the adverse effect of resource policing presence in the schools inevitable? Could this not change simply by changing the way policing is done, so that police could be perceived as being on the same side as those they are policing? Can we restore a true, quote unquote, to serve and protect culture rather than just giving it lip service? And could changes in the schools not help transform policing in the wider community? Whole set of questions there, but really important questions, I think. Can I have you guys jump in on any thoughts on those?
I'll kind of speak to the work that actually and I'll talk more about this in the November webinar when I talk about youth leadership for restorative justice. There's a number of student-led organizations that are doing work to transform their schools and in the school to prison pipeline in their communities. And so one of those groups, the Philly Student Union, it's a group in Philadelphia, they actually were able to win the right to train police officers in their school. Some of you who may be familiar with what has happened in Philly over the last few years know that several schools in Philadelphia were shut down, and that really put had a large effect on the wins that they've had and just the shape that the organizing has taken since those school closures. But that was one. And then in Colorado, these are just two examples. The group I referred to earlier, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, Parents and Youth United, they actually were able to influence the role of the police in their school through having a seat at the contract negotiations between the police department and the school district. And that took a lot of work. It took a lot of previous organizing, but to give that example as even with the police presence in the school, there are student leaders, there are organizers who have been working on how do we, even acknowledging that this is the case, how do we try to make some changes within that? And those are some ways that they've tried to do that. And so just to give an example, one of the things that they did with the contract is they made it clear that the police officers, that the school district has chosen, and this is again through the work of their organizing, they previously had won the right or won kind of some changes to the school discipline policies such that there was a much more of a focus on restorative justice and ending some of the zero tolerance policies. So that became something that was reflected in the contract between the police department and the school district. Another thing that became that it was included in that contract is that the police officers were not there to intervene in kind of minor misdemeanor offenses and arrest students for those things. So there can be some changes made to decrease the harms of the police, and there are some groups who are working in that direction.
My very first circle process training course that I went to was in Minnesota, and there was a police officer, a school resource officer in there. And it was really exciting to have him in there and the things that he would share about his own desire to work to build better relationships with the students in his school, even in the role that he was in. He didn't want to see it as an adversarial position, but more as a resource for the students. And I think he really had become that from some of the stories he shared. I know that Fairfax County is also working. They have some restorative justice in place, and they are working now to make sure that school resource officers are trained and equipped in restorative justice as well. So,
yeah. And while we're throwing out some resources, Our Joy in Oakland District Schools, Unified District Schools in California is doing some really good work, and they just came out with a comprehensive research evaluation of their program, linking their work in 60 schools in that district and really improving both suspension and expulsion and disproportionality, as well as the relationship with the police and the community and the schools. So I encourage you to look into some of those resources. I'm going to group two questions here quickly, which I think are connected. The one is, in a broad sense, there's someone who's asking here, I would be interested in hearing if there's been any research tying restorative justice and trauma-informed practice. Great question. But it also is sort of practicalized with this question: what role does the expression or processing of grief, both historical trauma and for current issues, play in helping the students find their way through these difficult situations? Could you also comment on what this might mean for me as a teacher? In other words, how do we open the space for folks to talk about the trauma, both what they've received as a legacy in some ways for some folks of historical harm, as well as the current everyday practices that are reinforcing that trauma?
Well, and I think that's where, and I don't have an expansive lit review under my belt on the role of trauma in learning, but one of the things that I haven't seen a whole lot is talking about those big structural pieces. I see I see some work on like interpersonal emotional awareness around trauma and how we can work with kids at that counseling level or things like that. But I haven't seen a lot, maybe Joanna has, but on the role of structural or systemic kind of trauma, historical trauma. That's your kind of niche too, Carl, right? Is looking at historical trauma. Mm-hmm. So, so I can't speak a whole lot to that, except that we need to talk about that more.
I think that, I mean, in terms of this kind of trauma, interpersonal trauma, that or intrapersonal, perhaps rather, that students are dealing with. Just last school year, I was working in an elementary school, and there was a student who had a number of challenges and was ultimately ended up being moved to a different school, a school for students with emotional disabilities. And one of my roles at the school was a reading resource teacher. And so looking at his reading scores the previous 2 years, there was a huge drop in basically 2 years prior in his reading scores. And that drop exactly matched the time in which his family had moved into a homeless shelter. And his family was in a homeless shelter for over a year. And so imagine, and this was a very large homeless shelter where people are living and essentially in one room in cots. And this was actually the same homeless shelter where Relisha Rudd disappeared, the homeless shelter that this child lived in for over a year with his family. So imagine the trauma. And we did not have the resources at the school. And even I was speaking with another staff member who worked in the district office. We didn't have the resources even at the school district to support students who had major challenges around trauma. And the resources that we did have, some of them were not necessarily being used effectively in terms of mental health clinicians that were available and kind of what they did with their time and things like that. And so one, in terms of the structural piece, is definitely moving even out of the classroom, needing to have school psychologists available, needing to have mental health clinicians, school social workers available, and those are being cut quite a bit. And again, the kind of over reliance on policing. So talked about that before. It's not to say all police officers individually are bad, but what are resources being used for and what's most effective? And then secondly, in terms of just in the classroom, there are definite things that teachers can do. I'm sure you all have talked in the previous webinars about, circle practices and the ways, and even just a few minutes of checking in is helpful for students. Also, there are ways to integrate that into curriculum. I taught a lesson as a special education English teacher where I had students, they read a story. I can't remember the name of the story right now, but it was a story about a young man who, actually I think it was called Catching the Moon. It was a story about a young man who had lost his mother, and it took place actually after he had lost his mother, and he had a number of issues. Basically, he was going through the grieving process. And so what I used that story was, we not only looked at it as literature, but we were able to, I actually invited a school counselor into my classroom, and 2 of them ended up coming into the classroom, and we did a lesson on the stages of grief. And so they were actually able to take things that happened in the story with the main character, Louise, and identify when was he in the anger stage of grief? When was he in this stage of grief? And then they were able to then think about themselves at the same time and kind of passing through those stages of grief. So there's ways to incorporate social emotional awareness and that type of education that is helpful for students into the curriculum and the content.
Here's a question. Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, I know that there's a good bit of connection between social emotional capacity building and restorative justice, and the way that some of the restorative justice practices can and just do build emotional literacy, emotional and social capacity. So Anne Schumacher has a nice article about circle processes at a school in Michigan, where she worked with groups of girls and just talked about the increased emotional capacity from just sitting in circle and being able to listen to one another and feel like there was a safe place with a shared community of people, and the impact that had on classroom attendance and behavior and learning, as well as the emotional capacity.
So on this note, but I think we'll move then on to some structural questions, but here's one more around sort of race and the teacher and in the classroom. Assume the teacher believes in RJ and is new and white. You want to use icebreakers and take kids responding to, all the stuff that you're using. But understandably, white is under suspicion and adds to a wall that teachers find necessary to get over. Do you ever initially address your own race up front and just talk about it?
That's what we did today in class. I think if I'm a white teacher, I have to address my own whiteness, both internally and how it impacts my class and the way I interact with my class. I do think we need to have more explicit conversations about race and racial awareness and the ways in which we understand and don't understand one another across those racial differences. Those conversations are helpful. Depending on the age of the student, will depend on how those conversations happen. But for me, I find that circle processes are safe places for those conversations to happen. We lay down certain assumptions about how we are in circle together. We speak from first person language. We accept people where they are without judgments. And then we move together in a place of growth. And so for me, I really appreciate the way that circle processes create those spaces. Joanna, oh my goodness.
I mean, just an anecdote. I remember Kathy Evans, along with another Center for Justice and Peace Building staff member, came to the school that I worked at last year, which is a majority Black school in the sense of the student body and the faculty and staff, with the exception of one white teacher. And Kathy, in speaking to the group that she met with, group of staff, was very upfront about her race and about that difference. And actually, people reacted very positively and said that was really helpful for her to own that, for us to talk about it, and to, rather than pretend that it's not there, pretend that that difference wasn't there, and actually help the conversation quite a bit.
I'm gonna grab here, put two more together, two more questions, and I'm trying to manage these as best I can, but I think these could be connected. Is there any research being conducted on how to best communicate this information to people who are resistant to the message? And then more specifically, someone asked, any suggestions on how to approach a school district that wants to perform RJ internally? I'm noticing the district is taking the road of least resistances. The school administrators call it restorative practices. I'm worried that the school district will perform RJ poorly and give it a bad name. And then a third question tied to this is, someone has asked us to talk a little bit about how we differentiate restorative practices and restorative justice, more specifically.
Do you want to jump on that? Me too.
I'll jump in on restorative practices. I think I'd put it this way: we don't have an issue with restorative practices in and of themselves. In other words, we're all for good practice.
Yes.
And good means ethical and understandable and one that's taking into consideration the whole context. What we're concerned about is there has been a tendency, as there is in many disciplines as they begin to expand and grow, and that is to refer to restorative practices as technical skills that become sort of formulaic and that are sort of an add-on, like I'm going to do restorative practices adding on to whatever your menu of good practices are. And sometimes that can be inappropriately assigned in a context. It can be inappropriately used if you're not considering the context and considering the issues that we're talking about here today, which are much deeper. So it can be seen as something that's light and surfacey, or isn't connecting, or in fact even harmful, or just patronizing. And so we want to move beyond that to keep the justice in that conversation, because much of what we're talking about is growing out. These institutional issues that we're talking about are growing out of injustices not being addressed.
So just for an example, I observed a circle process where the teacher had the talking piece in her hand, but when she passed it, the second student that to her right made a comment, and you could see the teacher's body language. She crossed her shoulders, she hunched up, she had a disapproving look on. I mean, in that moment, she was still maintaining her right to judge what that student was saying in response to the question. So she was doing a circle process, but because she hadn't examined her own power and her own role in that moment, I'm sure that the student probably didn't feel like that was a safe place for them to share what they were thinking or to express what they were feeling. And so I think without attaching restorative practices to an underlying belief system that we would call restorative justice, we can do things that really aren't very restorative, even though they're the right practices. Does that make sense? Yes.
Definitely. Yeah.
Makes sense to us. We can't hear from the folks out there.
Yes.
But I hope you're starting to address that question.
We're answering for them.
Any experiences about approaching resistant administrators or, other teachers or those that resist this process, in ways in which you try to communicate that and influence or talk about this?
Well, I have to come out. No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry.
Joanna, go ahead.
I was going to say that you all know that my focus in particular is looking at youth leadership and how young people are involved, not just as participants, but really as leading this process in their schools. And so in the work that I've learned about that has gone on in schools in terms of communication, what organizations and student groups have often started doing in the beginning of trying to bring these policies into their schools, shift the paradigm really of their schools, is to begin with research, to begin with often a participatory research project. So they may often do surveys and survey the student body or particular groups of students on their experiences with suspensions, provide them a means to tell their stories, capture statistical data, and look at disproportionalities, look at what are the offenses for which students are being suspended and expelled, what are they experiencing in their classes, what was happening at the time that they were arrested, for example, in their school or outside of their school. And so beginning there is very helpful and it's very important because, one, it begins with student stories, it begins with statistics, it begins with laying down what is going on. And then the other part is how you frame the issue. And one thing that groups have found is that it's very important to keep those discussions around systems of oppression, for example, keeping discussions around racial justice in the picture, because that definitely has a role in the outcome and what is addressed or what's included in the policies that are actually written down when everyone comes to the table.
Absolutely.
I was only going to add there that as we address these things and as we work with people who are resistant, I think it's really important that we live out of our own restorative belief system as we interact. So focusing on relationships. So if I'm speaking with a principal who is kind of skeptical about circle processes, I don't want to use power to try to win them over. I want to use relationship because that's the restorative way. And so really, as we work to evoke or bring about social change, to do so in ways that are consistent with what we say we believe. So, for example, I know that there are whole school districts who are being mandated to use restorative justice practices. And I struggle with that a little bit, right? Because while I want us to not suspend and expel kids, I also wonder, how is a teacher experiencing a moment where I'm not allowed to address issues, or they perceive that they're not being allowed to address the issues that are interfering with learning, without adequate training or preparation to carry out those practices. And so I think we have to be careful that as we move restorative justice forward, we do so in ways that are consistent internally with what we say we believe.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things we need to be careful of is back to some of this distinction between restorative practices and restorative justice is keeping the conversation, and this connects with what you were saying, Johanna, too, keeping the conversation on in schools, particularly around schools' environment, changing schools' environment. The environment includes a lot more than adding on a new program, if you will, or a new skill set, and that then affects how we understand training and coaching and accompanying teachers, if you will. So this isn't a once-off training event and then we go restorative. I think from the way we're looking at it, this is a process that we're taking our joy in Oakland has been working at this since 2008, I think. This is a process of bringing a district into a place where they're talking about restorative justice being the default, not the add-on.
Sure.
Go ahead. One of the things that we are doing when we work with new schools is we have a restorative justice self-assessment inventory, and we're looking at an appreciative inquiry model where we find out what are you already doing that is consistent with restorative justice, and let's acknowledge that and bring attention to that. So for example, one of the things on that list is, in order to create a welcoming school climate, maybe every morning there are people sitting at the bus stop greeting students with a smile, not with a, hey, get that hat off your head, pull your pants up or whatever, not with those messages, but with, hey, I'm really glad you're here today. So like maybe a school's already doing that and they don't know anything about restorative justice yet, but they're already doing some of those kinds of things that are building classroom or school climate. So let's acknowledge that and then just build on that over time, again, rather than saying we're going to implement a new program called restorative justice. Let's start to change the overall climate using some of these practices or principles.
I also want to throw in the mix, a trend that's going on and affecting all of our schools in the United States, which is high stakes testing and how that feeds into the school to prison pipeline. There are numbers of teachers and students, parents, various groups all over who are trying to challenge high stakes testing and this kind of overemphasis on testing because of the way in which it really does undermine some of the things that you've talked about, Kathy, in terms of student engagement and students just really feeling like they're really being taught to a test rather than being taught to be prepared for their goals later in life.
I agree. And one of the things that I'm seeing that's really fun is seeing teachers and parents and students kind of come together to maybe resist some of those testing practices, and that's creating a shared sense of purpose around our school. And I think that was part of the work at the Padres y Jóvenes as well. Yes, no, maybe.
I'm not sure about that one, but I can say that it is very difficult. It is very difficult, and it also does, especially when we're talking about under-resourced schools, because some of those resources does depend upon testing. It does place the schools and the teachers at a very precarious position. So as a teacher, it was, I was required to test students, and I was required to test students who were going to have a very difficult time with testing, and that was challenging. And so it's not, if there is a culture, if there's a group in the school who's able to figure some of those things out, I think that is excellent. But I think that we definitely have to continue trying to figure out ways to chip away, both kind of at the school level, but also really at the district, state, and national level at this culture of high stakes testing, because it is doing a lot to feed the school to prison pipeline. And a great resource on that fairtest.org actually has an infographic called How High Stakes Testing Feeds the School to Prison Pipeline, as well as other resources for people who want to get involved in how to really challenge this focus on testing.
Thanks. You're muted.
You realize Carl's on mute.
You're on mute, Carl.
Wow, sorry about that. There was some noise going on. Sorry, folks. We're going to have to wind the conversation down. Thanking our two guests. Thank you very much. There are a few questions lingering, but they're mostly around resources. For instance, do you have useful resources and articles for sharing this information in schools to recommend? Do you have RJ programs for schools that you recommend? We have been talking about some of these as we've been having the conversation, but I'm wondering, Kathy, if you want to address any of that. Have we been putting some resources on with the webinars that we've had in the past, and can folks find that on the website?
One of the things that I'm really excited to announce is that in the education department, we do have a restorative justice in education program now. We're offering a 15-hour graduate certificate as well as a concentration. So I know that one of the things that we're hoping to do is to provide more specific training preparation for teachers who are wanting to be restorative justice minded educators. But we're also working to provide some resources on our website. We also have a Facebook page, Restorative Justice and Education, so you can find us there, and people are posting resources there as well. And I'm always accessible, so email me and I can send you research articles. I can send you some nice PowerPoints and videos that help articulate what restorative justice looks like in schools. And then I also want to bring up the next webinar. It will be specifically on restorative justice practices. We will look at what people are doing in different places to express restorative justice in school settings.
Great. Johanna, anything you wanted to add on the resource-wise?
In terms of resources, there is a website. It's not necessarily being updated right now, but I believe it's suspensionstories.org or suspensionstories.com. This is a website that was created by a number of particularly youth-led organizations who are compiling resources, including videos, their own experiences, various resources that they have related to ending the school-to-prison pipeline and advancing more equitable policies in their schools. So that's a great place to start, particularly when you're talking about what are young people saying, what are they dealing with, and what are they doing.
All right, so I thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back over to Jordan to take us through our last few announcements here at the end. And thank you all for joining us, those out in the cyber world. We appreciate it. Jordan?
Yep, thank you, Carl. My name is Jordan Detweiler-Michelson, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peace Building here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And I work part-time as the graduate assistant to the Zehr Institute, and just have a couple of announcements on what's coming up and what's on the menu for the future. A special thanks to our panelists today for a really engaging conversation on a challenging and complex issue. We're in the midst of a multi-part series on restorative justice in education. As Kathy mentioned, our next and final RJE webinar will be taking place later in September. The date is the 21st, and that'll be at 3 p.m. EST. The topic is on restorative justice in everyday school practices, which will be a panel discussion. Also, as was mentioned, there are recordings of previous webinars available online at the zehrinstitute.org/webinars. The Zehr Institute, in addition to this special series on RJE, has a full and exciting lineup of RJ webinars coming up through the rest of the year. They are listed on our website as well. But real quickly, those topics include Native American spirituality and restorative justice. We'll have a session with Lauren Walker, who is a longtime practitioner and extensive author in the field of restorative justice and practices. Youth leadership for restorative justice with our very own Johanna Turner, and lessons from 18 years of community conferencing and restorative practices in Baltimore. We'll also have a session on restorative approaches to sexual assault on college campuses. So please stay tuned for more information and for those webinars as they come up. A little bit more about the Zehr Institute and its relation to Eastern Mennonite University. Eastern Mennonite University is located in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and it offers undergraduate programs and several graduate programs such as the MA in Conflict Transformation, Business Administration, Counseling, Biomedicine, and Education. EMU also has a seminary program and is the host to the Summer Peacebuilding Institute. And feel free to learn more about our programs online at emu.edu. One of the programs that was mentioned earlier, and I know there was a question about the intersection between restorative justice and trauma awareness or trauma-informed practices, I highly recommend checking out the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. There are 2 levels of training. The level 1 is an introductory training to the materials of trauma awareness and resilience. Level 2 goes deeper, providing trainees with tools to become trainers themselves and carry these lessons into their organizations and into their practices. There are several trainings available in Washington, D.C. at the United States Institute of Peace, as well as here at Eastern Mennonite University. And that goes the same for both level 1 and level 2 trainings. As I mentioned earlier, the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding offers a graduate program in, it's a Master's of Arts in Conflict Transformation. It's a practice-based curriculum exploring nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict. A lot of the classes focus on restorative justice, psychosocial trauma, strategic peacebuilding, and other topics, and you can learn more about that program online at emu.edu. As Carl mentioned, we also have and offer a restorative justice graduate certificate. This is really great for those who are working in the field, may not have time for a full MA program, but want to get engaged in classes that help them to reflect on your own work or increase your knowledge and skills in restorative justice. And I know that last year we offered at least one class that was available online to accommodate distance learning, and people were able to beam in from different parts of the country. And lastly, as Kathy had mentioned, we are very excited to offer the Restorative Justice in Education program as a graduate certificate and as a special concentration within the MA program. So more information is available online on the web through our website. Finally, speaking of websites, the Zehr Institute is really excited to announce the new website, zehr-institute.org. Please visit often and check out webinars that we're posting, recordings of webinars that will be made available, and different ways to stay connected to the Zehr Institute and get connected to resources that are available. So with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Carl, who's going to close out our time together. Carl?
So once again, thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate you coming out and spending this time and having this conversation with us, and we encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions or comments that you may have. And as you go from here, live restoratively and act restoratively. And we'll look forward to seeing you back at another webinar in the future. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you.